Hey everyone, I'm Nate,
And I'm John.
and welcome back to Casual Theology.
We're back.
And today's episode is going to be very relevant in 2021 when it comes out. If you're watching this in the far future, when COVID-19 is ancient history, you're probably going to have no idea what the heck we're talking about, but don't worry, this has been a problem since before the COVID pandemic hit, so
Yeah, some of the principles
yeah.
are going to be pretty universal, and who knows, there might be a new pandemic in a few years.
Of course, if you've probably guessed by now, we're of course talking about masks and vaccines and the mandates, and
I imagine we'll put that in the title of the video, so hopefully
yeah.
when you clicked it, you'll know what you're clicking on.
But yeah. So with when the whole thing with COVID hit back a year ago, it sort of reignited this whole excuse me reignited the debate on masks and vaccines, or anti-masking or anti-vaxxing. Is that
I
even a
don't know
real
about
verb?
reigniting. I don't remember that being an issue my whole life.
At least with the masks, it
But what it
ignited for the
was,
first
what,
time.
what did happen was it highlighted the role of media and government and really for Christians, where are the lines
Right.
with what we follow and what we don't follow, and why? What are our criteria for following the government? But then also you have this whole thing of, well, let's just leave the government out of it, and what would we have done without any government involvement?
And yeah, there's a whole spectrum of angles on this thing, because there's people who are like pro-mandate or anti-mandate, but pro the things that are being mandated, or there are people who are just against them on principle, or they're for one against the other. Just
and it's
all
on.
over the place.
And I've seen it on every side of the aisle politically. I know Republicans that are very pro-vax, and I know Democrats on the other side. It's not necessarily, even though the media tries to portray it in one like monolith. I've seen it everywhere on both sides. Every kind of opinion you can have exists on both sides of the aisle, and it exists regardless of religion or race. Like these things are not universal to any group. And so what we're going to talk about today, since this is called Casual Theology, is we're going to talk about what how our theology shapes our response. And this is one, I'll tell you, I'll just be transparent. I didn't want to make this video. I don't like this topic. I'm sick of talking about it. I'm sick of thinking about it. I want this pandemic to be over, and I want these mandates to be over, and I want everybody to be healthy and safe and happy. So,
and on my side of the story, I really wanted to do this because I've got the blood boiling in the back of my head from that one time that one guy called you an apostate for opposing the mask mandate last year.
Yeah, it was not the first or last time that, although it was maybe the most extreme time. That's the most extreme thing said against me. But yeah.
So really the question we're asking is anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-mandate ideology theologically sound?
Okay. Anti-mask. Let's start with why wear a mask? Why do we wear a mask? What's the point?
And honestly, for me, it all really boils down to the thing Jesus said was the second great commandment: love your neighbor, love the people around you.
Right. So what the implication of that statement is that you are loving people best by wearing a mask.
Exactly.
Right.
You're keeping yourself from spreading stuff to them. You're keeping things from spreading to you that you can spread to them.
Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate and say people use the exact same concept, loving my neighbor as myself, as the reason not to wear a mask. And the reason being that the mask, in their mind, in their view, doesn't help. At best, it doesn't help, or it helps so the margin of help is so small that it's not worth it. Some have suggested, and I think there's some definitely some evidence to support this, that most people are not wearing N95 masks, and and most people are not washing their masks daily. So the germs that you get over the course of a day are on that mask just as much as anywhere as if you weren't wearing it.
But then again, you're not passing those to other people because you're probably going to be the only one wearing a mask. That particular.
Well, right, like you're
individual
not giving your mask to somebody else and like,
I-
here, you don't have a mask, wear
Like,
mine.
I don't get how,
Right.
like, personally, it's not really computing how not wearing a mask is still loving your neighbor, because it's not like wearing a mask is going to cause your neighbor to get sick.
Say that again. It's not like
wearing a mask will cause your neighbor to get sick.
okay.
It's not like, so like, if I'm wearing a mask, you're not going to get sick because I'm wearing a mask.
Correct. Right. And that makes sense on both sides. I think people would say, well, yeah. The question is it helping? And a lot of people are coming to the conclusion that it's not. And for them, I'm not going to wear a mask because I feel like I'm feeding into this lie that the masks help, and they don't. And to be honest, I'll tell you right now that my view on this has shifted over the course of a year. In 2020, even at this time in 2020, I was saying that we ought to wear a mask for the sake of those around us, regardless of what the government is saying. I don't even care about the mandate. I'm caring about my neighbor who is 70 years old and is a cancer survivor. Okay, and this is hypothetical, but we both go to the same church, and there are a lot of older people, and there are a lot of concerned people, and for the sake of them and them alone, I will wear a mask. Then several months passed. This was October of last year. Now it's October of 2021. But in March of 2021, after washing my hands, wearing a mask, social distancing for a year, for a full year, you know what happened to me?
You got the Rona.
I got corona. I got the virus. I got it. My whole family got it. And we were fine. We're all fine. And I started to have a change of heart about the masks, partly because I had done everything right. I had worn the masks, I had social distance, I had washed my hands.
Was this before the vaxes came out?
They were brand new. They were new.
Okay.
The vaccines had been out for maybe a month or two at that point. They had been available. I had the opportunity to get them, and I didn't. That's a separate thing. We're not there yet.
Right.
But I got the coronavirus, and in retrospect, I am glad I did. I'm glad I got it. I'm glad I got the coronavirus, and I'm glad my family got it. Because we had a dilemma about whether or not to get vaccinated. We were kind of praying and thinking about it and trying to decide. And when this happened, we're like, oh, well, that's the decision. We don't need to get vaccinated because now I have, by all accounts that I've found, I'm better protected than people who are vaccinated. In fact, one of my friends who was vaccinated at the time that I could have been vaccinated, I just found out right now has COVID. And I'm like, wow. So I avoided getting vaccinated and I just went straight to getting COVID. And a lot of people are getting COVID even though they're vaccinated. Granted, I will submit that the data that I've seen says you are less likely to go to the hospital or die if you've been vaccinated and then you get COVID. And that's good.
I mean, you're less likely to get it in the first place if you've been vaccinated.
Yeah, that's what they're saying, and that's probably
like by miles and miles.
Yeah, I've just known quite a few people who have been vaccinated and still got it. I've actually known multiple people, and I just
you have interesting luck in friends.
Yeah, perhaps. So all that is to say that I have changed, and now I actually don't wear a mask unless I have to, and the only place I have to is in my place of employment. I don't wear a mask anywhere else. Which is right here. Yeah, I work at a church, and I'm employed here. I've been told I should wear a mask when I'm here, and I do. And I don't complain about it. I'm fine wearing a mask. But I have come to the conclusion that we are more than a year, like a year and a half into this thing, and the numbers are still relatively high if you look at the numbers of people getting coronavirus. And a lot of people are wearing masks. And I'm really scratching my head going, are the masks helping at all? Like, is it really helping? Because people are wearing masks and still getting it.
Although the last data I saw indicated that most of the cases were in more rural areas where people were making a big show of not taking precautions.
Yeah, that's possible. That might be it. That might be true. I don't know about that particular statistic, but at any rate, that's where I'm at personally on that issue. But that's just Matt. We haven't even talked about vaccines yet, really.
Meanwhile, here I am. It's like I'm gonna love my neighbor by wearing the mask wherever I go, because maybe studies will come out in the future that prove that it doesn't work. But I think as long as there's at least the ghost of a chance that it will keep me from spreading anything to the people around me, I feel it's the most loving thing to do.
And I completely respect that. And I think people who want to wear a mask should wear a mask, and I would support it. I wouldn't look down on you for it. I think that that's an expression of human freedom, and that's good.
We might scratch our heads at each other, but...
And not only that, but my kids, 2 out of the 3 go to school. No, 3 out of 3. All 3 of them go to school where they have to wear a mask, and they do. And I'm not fighting it. I'm not upset about it.
Actually, one of them goes to the same school where I work.
Yeah, that's right. So you know, if it doesn't bother me, it just if I don't have to, I'm not going to, because I don't think it's that helpful. That's where I'm at. So we were talking though about theology. So far, this isn't really what the theology question is. What is loving my neighbor? What does loving my neighbor look like? We have talked before about promoting life. We want to promote life. We are pro-life in every sense of the word.
In fact, our first 5 videos were specifically using that theme to talk about different political, social issues.
Right. And this is certainly going to fall into that category. We want to promote life, and the belief that is out there, which is at least partly true, undeniably true, is that COVID kills people, right? We know this. This is a fact.
Kills a lot of people.
It kills a lot of people.
And it spreads like the dickens, too.
So if we're a pro-life people, we want to get it out in front of this. We want to stop it. We don't want people to die.
We want to take the precautions.
Right. It's the same reason I wear a seatbelt in the car. Yes, it is.
That's the argument my dad uses a lot.
Is it?
Or it's either my dad or my mom uses to oppose the opposition to the mandate.
Okay.
Or to support the mandates.
To support the mandates, right.
But we're not going to talk about the mandates yet. We're going to...
First, we're talking about the masks and the vaccines, just on their own, without any government involvement.
whether it's theologically sound to oppose them on principle.
Right. And so the question that is, I think, almost unanswerable, and I don't think we're going to answer it today, where the disagreement lies, is, are masks helpful enough to be worth it? Are vaccines helpful enough to be worth it? And that's the baseline. That's before the government gets involved.
Right.
Those 2 questions need to be answered. Are we loving our neighbor better by wearing masks and getting vaccines?
And so far, I think we've kind of talked masks specifically to death.
Right. Yes.
So now we're going to move on to, I think we should move on to vaccines, because I know there's been a bit of an anti-vax movement for a long time, even before COVID became a thing. I know long before it started, I was seeing anti-vax stuff on my Facebook.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Definitely coming from the more conservative segment of my friend base.
Right. That was a weird one because I saw it on
Yeah.
both. I saw anti-vax before COVID. I saw it on both sides of the political spectrum.
Wait, seriously?
Oh yeah,
Both sides?
yeah, because it tended to be this. There's a segment of the population that's an all natural, all organic
Oh,
kind of group.
right. The holistic medication.
And they tend to be anti-vax, and they don't tend to align to one side or the other, so they can be both. They can be, in terms of political affiliation. And that group seemed to be one that I saw having this anti-vax. And of course, there were these studies that linked it to autism, and that was where it came from, was with some parents were convinced that vaccines gave their kids autism.
Well, I'm actually on the spectrum, so if vaccines are what caused that in me, I'm actually kind of thankful.
You're thankful for being on the spectrum.
Yeah, it's it's had a lot of effects on me that have made my life pretty nice.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, and there's actually
But
some.
we're going on a tangent, of course.
It's a little bit of a tangent, but it is. We're just trying to explain why anti-vax exists. Why are people against vaccines when vaccines, by definition, are meant? Their intention is to help, right?
And one of the biggest arguments, one of the biggest anti-vax arguments I've seen, and I think one of the ones that really leaves me scratching my head theology is like, and making me think like, how do you theologically support this? Is the people who say we should put our trust in Jesus, we should put our trust in the Holy Spirit to heal us, and not put our trust in vaccines.
Right. Well,
and I've actually very deliberately crafted an argument against that argument.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll
go for it.
Share it for the peanut
I
gallery
have
here.
one too, so I'm probably on the same page with you on that
Okay.
one. But go ahead.
So the way I see it, of course, God He created all of reality, all the universe, or however many universes He created. That may be a topic for a different video, but and in so doing, He also created the physical laws, the chemical laws, the biological laws that everything works by, that our scientists have discovered. And that must mean that vaccines are using natural processes that God hard-coded into our universe. And so the people who say, put your trust in Jesus and not in vaccines, and don't get vaccines, it's like saying, you should only trust God to heal you supernaturally.
Right.
Like, it's not legitimate if He heals you through the processes He created in the first place. And I thought, well, what the heck, guys? It's still God healing you.
Yeah.
It's like we don't have the prerogative to say this is how God must work.
Right.
That's not our call.
Right. Yeah.
God isn't. He's
so,
under no obligation to us. He doesn't answer to us.
Right. I would say that argument, that particular argument, is a poor argument. It's not a good one.
Wait, my argument or the one I'm arguing against?
No, the one you're arguing against.
Okay.
The argument that we should let God protect us is kind of silly. I mean, it's silly even, in the Bible.
At least let Him protect us supernaturally only.
That would be like David saying, I'm not going to have an army for Israel. We're just going to let God protect us. Like, what? No, that's not it. Or I'm not going to we go back to the seatbelt. I'm not going to wear a seatbelt. I'll let God protect me. Like, that's
I'm
dumb.
gonna walk off the edge of the Grand Canyon because God will protect me from gravity.
Yeah.
No, dude, no.
There's a scene in Bruce Almighty where Jim Carrey walks out in the middle of the street and gets hit by a truck. And he's like, God, why didn't you stop that? He's like, you were just being stupid. I'm paraphrasing. I actually don't remember word for word.
No, I remember that scene.
What they said in the scene.
I remember that scene.
But it's like, why are you expecting God to protect you if you're not even willing to take a little bit of effort to protect yourself? And so, I think that particular argument is not good. However, there is the reason that argument even gets made is because there's usually, I think there's some other argument in their hearts and minds that they're not, that they should make instead, and the argument is whether or not the thing is effective and safe and good.
I think the overwhelming majority of cases, vaccines have been demonstrably effective.
Mm-hmm.
It's like how many diseases have been made completely extinct because of smallpox, polio. Those are the only two I can think of off the top of my head. But
yeah, well, and
by the way, isn't smallpox coming back or something?
Smallpox was the first vaccine, I think, ever.
Okay.
And it was discovered in the 19th century, like a long time ago.
And then we extinctified smallpox.
Basically. But what's one of the arguments, and I think it's got merit. I'm not going to defend that argument because I haven't done the research. But one of the arguments is that the COVID-19 vaccine is altogether different than any other vaccine we've ever had. And there's a point there. It's an mRNA vaccine. That makes it different than all the other vaccines we've ever had. And people are very concerned because it's new. And people are always concerned about what is new. And for good reason. Sometimes what is new has consequences that you didn't expect. And sometimes those consequences take a year or 2 or 5 or 10 to figure out. And so there's some, I think, legitimate apprehension from some people over taking something that's so new. Even though the evidence we have currently is that it is mostly safe and mostly effective, there is that question mark.
And of course, there have been outlying cases.
Of course, and there have. And I looked into those today in preparation of this video, and some of the really extremely negative effects, including death, range in the tens of thousands. The fact is that some people, even doing their research, have issues with masks or vaccines. Our question is, what do we do as Christians who want to follow the Bible, who want to follow the Word of God, who want to love our neighbor as ourselves? What is our course of action? And my belief as a Christian is that you are free to get the vaccine if you want to get the vaccine. And I am free to not get the vaccine if I don't want to get the vaccine. But both of us must be convinced in our own mind that we are doing what is right, that what God wants, and what is going to be most loving to our neighbor. The loving your neighbor is something we are agreed upon.
I do think we should also be able to plausibly support our decision theologically.
Okay, yes.
Not in a way that can be picked apart like I picked apart the whole trusting God, not in vaccines argument.
Right, yes.
And once again, I think it just boils down to love your neighbor. How can you best love your neighbor? And personally, I think that by a long shot, the best way is to get the vax.
Right. And I know plenty of people, godly people, that would agree with you. And I think that for most people, I would actually say that that's true. I do know of enough people who fall into weird categories where, for one reason or another, they won't get it, and I think it's the best decision for them.
Like maybe they're allergic to something in vaccines or...
Mm-hmm. I know of one person who was told by her doctor not to get it. I know of another person who kind of wanted to get it, but then and then ended up getting the first one, and it made them sick, and they didn't get the second one.
Okay, then.
I also know people who are concerned because they've had other vaccines and had negative reactions to those. I had a negative reaction to the flu shot.
Really?
Oh yeah, really negative. And And as a result of that, I was really concerned about this vaccine and opted not to get it. And then my brother, who shares a lot of my genes, we are related, he got more sick from the first vaccine shot than I got from having COVID.
Ooh, that's rough.
And it lasted a lot longer. For me, it was 2 or 3 weeks. For him, it was 2 months of the just the you could call it side effects, but it just the effects of the vaccine. And so I think it's good for people to have the right to look at themselves and their history, their medical history, and decide for themselves what ought to be done.
It's like the conundrum posed in, what was it, 1 Corinthians or something like that? Like between the law of liberty versus the law of love.
Yes, yeah, that's a great example. I can't remember exactly where that is.
I remember reading it really recently. So it was in one of the epistles. I think one of Paul's specifically.
Yeah.
First Corinthians or something.
Yeah, I'm looking in 1 Corinthians to see if it's in there. Oh, actually, I'm in 2 Corinthians.
Please excuse us while we search in our Bibles for something. Or maybe it was in Romans.
It could be. I'm not sure.
Or
I feel like I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember exactly where.
Or wait a minute. I think I read this really recently, and I was reading Colossians recently. Maybe it's in there.
Okay. But the concept is that we are choosing a law of liberty. We are under grace, not under law. That's Romans. That's in Romans. It talks a lot about being under grace and not under law. And we're talking not about civil law or government. We're talking about God's law. We are not even under God's law. We are under grace. But that doesn't mean we ignore God's law. It means we are not doomed to hell if we accidentally break it, or even if we intentionally break it, if we repent. So that's one of the concepts of law and grace that the Bible talks about. But when it talks about, when we're talking about individual responsibility and freedom, and deciding for yourself as an adult, as a free agent, what you ought to do, I think that we as a Christian body ought to support one another even in divergent views on this issue.
And even if we can't figure out how the other guy's theologically sound.
Well, right. Absolutely. There's all sorts of weird views that Christians have about things in the Bible.
Prosperity gospel, anyone?
Which is one of the reasons we're doing this channel, is to talk about the theological differences that Christians have, and to do so kind of casually, not with an eye to say, hey, if you're a Christian, you have to believe this way exactly, or you're not a Christian. I don't ever want to.
We might come down and say we both think this viewpoint is more theologically sound.
Right. Well, and we can say I can support it with this verse and that verse, and I can do that.
And we could pick apart the people who support the other thing with this verse and that verse.
Yeah. And of course, there are going to be some issues where I can say, no, this is what the Bible says, this is what it means, and you better believe it. But I can't do that with vaccines and masks. I can't do that with. I can't even do that with mandates. I've tried to kind of figure out if there's a what would you call it? Just like a golden rule that you can go to and say, this is what proves that this is the way you ought to think about it.
Right.
And you can't, because there's too much. There are too many variables. It's too complicated an issue. There are too many unknowns, and any viewpoint you take makes a few assumptions. And one of those assumptions is this is the safest thing and the best thing for you and your neighbor. Or this is unhealthy and unsafe and you're not trusting God. both of those are assumptions that I can't prove. So anyway,
Since you mentioned mandates just now, do you think it would be a good idea to segue to
we can talk briefly about
anti-mandate?
mandates.
So, for a little bit of background for those of you watching this in the next century or so, early on, like in 2020, when COVID first started cropping up, there was a mask mandate. Everyone in public spaces was required to wear a mask. And then more recently, there's been, at least here in Oregon, there's been a vaccine mandate where all the public employees are required to be vaccinated, all the school and medical people.
Yep.
And I know a lot of the really vitriolic opposition to that has been people who let's just say there's been a lot of people who have made a really big show of defying the mandate.
Okay.
Like they're saying it's almost as if they're saying I'm holier because I'm defying the government on this.
Right.
And once again, I just can't help but scratch my head and say, what the heck?
Yeah.
And we were actually talking about this before we started recording, and we found a couple verses. They're probably the obvious verses that most people will probably think of when they think of defying the government along a theological basis.
There's only two that are really big, and they were big in 2020 when we were talking about masks, and they still get used in 2021 talking about vaccines.
And I just opened perfectly up to one of them right as I opened my Bible. That's really...
This is a very interesting section of Scripture because of the context it was written in.
One of the verses, or one of the passages, is the first little bit of Romans chapter 13, which says, "Everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist are instituted by God. So then the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be afraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have its approval. For government is God's servant for your good." And I'm going to cut that bit off partway through verse 4, because that's really where the afterwards it stops. It sort of gets away from
it goes
what we're trying to get at.
Right.
And I remember you mentioned there were a lot of people who thought that maybe Paul was talking more about spiritual authorities.
Yeah, and that he was talking descriptively, like this is what governments ought to be. This is what the governing authorities ought to be doing. This is an ought to paragraph in the Bible that says the authorities are God's servants for your good. Almost like that's ideal, that's descriptive of what they ought to be.
Because obviously we've had instances in history where governments have been kind of sketchy,
right? Well,
to put it mildly.
And so Rome, this is where this gets really complicated, because Rome, two things. First, Rome was evil against Christians frequently, not good, and disobeying them on certain things was actually required by Christianity. For example, if they told you you can't speak about your faith, we're going to speak about our faith anyway, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to obey the governing authorities in that. But second, the other thing that's weird about this is we're Americans. We're talking here in America about the mandates in America, and our country is so different from Rome. I mean, it's so different. We don't even, our authorities themselves don't even agree right now. Like, we have states who are saying, don't do what the federal government is telling you to do. We have state authorities going against government authorities, and people in those states are now asking, well, which authorities are my governing authorities? How do I follow Romans 13 when the authorities don't agree? And I think that's a very good question for us to address. We're not going to address it right now here because
Right.
that's a whole nother thing. But it just highlights, I want to highlight how complicated this is because it's so easy to vilify people who interpret it differently, but they interpret it differently because it's complicated. We live in a complicated world.
I will say though, you mentioned there were people who think that this particular passage, you haven't said it here on the video, but you told me before we started recording that there are at least a sizable contingent of people who interpret this as being more about spiritual authorities rather than earthly governments.
Well, the question is, who's the authority here? Is it God or is it the earthly government? So it says, for example, there is no authority except for God. It says that right there. No authority except for God. Well, God is the spiritual authority.
Does yours say for God or from God?
From God. For there is no authority except from God. Oh, you're right. I said for, didn't I?
Yep.
I misspoke. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Those that exist are Rome, are North Korea, are America. Those are authorities instituted by God. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? I'm jumping down to the second half of verse 3. Do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Do what is good, and you will receive the approval of who? God or the government? Because if you say, do what is good, and you will be approved by the government, that's not always true. That wasn't even true in Rome when Paul wrote this. It's certainly not true in North Korea. You can do what is good and still not receive the approval of the authorities, the earthly authorities that are over you.
But then, ironically, there's another passage that does talk specifically about earthly authorities.
And that's 2 Peter.
Yeah, 2 Peter, what, 3 something rather?
Oh, wait, you know what? I think it's 1 Peter 2, now that I think about it.
Oh, yeah, it's one of the Peters, second chapter.
1 Peter 2.
Wherever. 1 Peter, let me find it. 2, where are
It starts
you?
in verse 13.
13, there it is.
Yeah.
And
this
sorry,
is
I had to
really good
swallow.
stuff.
Submit to every human authority because of the Lord, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors as those sent out by him to punish those who do evil, and to praise those who do what is good.
And it says further, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people.
So here it's very clearly talking about earthly authorities, which in Peter's time was the very anti-Christian Roman regime.
Yep.
Which is rather interesting, I think.
It is. And it goes on to say, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. And where we have this big disconnect in our culture right now is there is a perceived, what's the word? A perceived contradiction between fearing God and honoring the emperor or the governing authorities. Which one is it? What if I can't do both? I can't fear God and honor the emperor.
I think the pastor at our church did a sermon on this, actually, and I think he made a really good point that I think lost our church a lot of members.
Yeah.
But he said that we are to obey earthly governments in all things, except where said governments mandate something that would hamper your relationship with God. And that's where I think the mask and vaccine mandates come into it, because like how is wearing a mask hampering your relationship with God? How is getting a vaccine hampering your relationship with God? I don't really think that you can make a case that it would.
How is wearing a patch that says you're a part of the Nazi party or that you're a Jew hinder your relationship with God? I ask the question because I don't think that criteria alone is sufficient. I think there are injustices in the world that Christians ought to fight.
Right.
And I think being forced to take a vaccine is one of them. I think that is an overstepping of the point and purpose of government. I think it's an overreach. I think it leans towards totalitarianism. I think that, and the reason I say this is because the consequences for not getting vaccinated, even if you have been told, there are no exceptions being talked about. Somebody like me who is fully inoculated and probably better protected than people who are vaccinated.
Actually, there have been at least
So
some
far, I haven't
government
heard
some
any-
governments have allowed for exemptions for
inoculated people
no,
who have
they've-
the antibodies?
no, they've offered exemptions for people from faith healing communities.
Really?
Because
That's new. I hadn't heard
my
that
uncle emailed my dad, who's an Anglican priest. He says, "Hey, can you tell my employer that your church believes in faith healing?" And dad cracked up because my uncle doesn't even live in the same town and hasn't been to a church in years.
yet. Interesting.
And he wanted my dad to say that our church does faith healing, which it doesn't either.
No, that's interesting. But the fact is that there are enough people who have past experiences, negative experiences with flu shots and vaccines. There are enough people who, like, let's say, hypothetically, that the vaccine was developed by the Nazi Party, all right, or by the Taliban or Al Qaeda or whoever, whatever the evil regime of the day happens to be. Let's say it was North Korea who produced the vaccine. Would we be honoring God to get it? If it was seen as, well, it might still be helpful. And that's a big, important, and difficult question to answer. And the reason I asked the question is because the companies behind the vaccines are making billions of dollars off of them. And they, in my experience, are pretty wicked, pretty messed up.
Probably the same companies that are making a killing off of insulin.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. So there is a ethical question of, do I support a company that is doing something that I believe is evil? Even if what they're giving me is probably helpful. Like, I think
even if getting it would be loving to my neighbor.
Possibly. Although that, again, is kind of a question mark of whether or not it would be. Like, for me, getting a vaccine is pointless. I don't think it would be loving to my neighbor. I think it would be a waste of my life, a waste of my time. And given my brother's reaction, it could be really dangerous. So I don't want to do it. And I don't plan to do it. And if I'm mandated to do it, I'll fight it. But I still think the vaccine's a good idea, and I'm glad it exists, and I'm glad that other people are getting it. I just don't want to get it for me.
But
and I don't think I should be told I have to.
Going back to the whole anti-mandate thing,
Right.
and we've talked about the verses about honoring the governing authorities, but
Right.
it seems that a lot of people within the church seem to disregard that. I know when Pastor Troy mentioned those verses in one of his sermons, our church hemorrhaged members.
Right.
And I want to say, like, this is still the inspired word of God. Is it somehow wrong?
Interpretation can be wrong, and it can be debatable. Like, I don't think that I'm not prepared to make public who was right and who was wrong. What I want to make public is that we ought to have grace with each other on our different views. We have different views. We should have grace with each other over these different views. And so what I'm saying from a theological point of view is, if something is not clear in Scripture because of the nuances of the specific, And when I say that, I'm talking about every major theological issue at once, not just vaccines and masks. I'm talking about baptizing babies, everything from that to how often you practice communion and the role of women in the church. All of these issues are secondary, and we ought, even if we have an opinion and a belief, we ought to bear with the opinions and beliefs of others on these kinds of issues. That's my position.
Wasn't it Paul who said, in the essentials agreement, in the non-essentials liberty, in all things love?
No, that's not in the Bible, actually.
I read that somewhere in one of the epistles.
You didn't read it in the Bible. No, that came from...
I specifically remember seeing it in here.
Oh gosh, it's killing me. I can't remember who said it. You might have read it in a footnote or a study note, but it's not a Bible.
I specifically remember reading it in here somewhere, not in a footnote either.
But it is true that in non-essentials we practice charity. Is the way that
charity.
It's been put. Historically, that's how we put it. We practice grace. We hold it in an open hand and say, you can believe differently.
My translation said liberty.
Liberty?
Yeah.
Okay.
See, now I gotta go back home and find it, and
you gotta find it.
tell him where I found, and tell him what
we might
verse
have
I
to
found
do
it
this
in.
whole video over again. I don't know. We've been talking for how long now? This is now a 30-minute video in addition to our previous almost 30-minute video. Well, I think we ought to be done for the day, and I think we might need to...
I think we've pretty much covered everything.
We did cover a lot. And like I said, my heart is really just to tell people, let's have grace with each other over these issues that we disagree on, and not be so narrow-minded as to think that our view is the only right view. Our interpretation of Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 is the only right interpretation. We can make a case, we can make our case, and we can say this is what I think, but I do not want to tell anybody that I have some sort of ex cathedra pope-like interpretation that you must believe or be shunned. And I want to extend that same grace to others, including people who have left our church over this issue, including the leadership in our church who have made a decision on this issue. I am a big fan of giving grace on these matters. So that's where I'm going to end. You want to say anything?
No, I think we've... I really don't think we need a part 2 to this video. I think we've said all we really set out to say.
Okay, fair enough.
So, in lieu of end of video banter, we're just gonna say the usual end of video spiel. Like if you like what you see here, click the like button, leave a comment. There's a little bell button somewhere. I still haven't found it yet, but it'll make YouTube send you emails when we put up another video.
And this issue is so filled with strong opinions that you're almost guaranteed to not like something I said or something he said or both.
So yeah, please keep the comments section civil.
Yeah, you can express your opinion below and do so respectfully and lovingly. And I don't want to have to turn our comments off, but we will if it gets crazy.
Oh, we will?
Yeah. I will.
Okay. Fair enough.
All right.
You got yourself a deal.
All right, good.
Well, until next time, have a good day.
Yeah.